I'm Dr. Randall Smith, and for about the last 25 years I've had the privilege of traveling the lands of Israel, Jordan, Egypt, Turkey, Greece, Cyprus, and Italy as we've been exploring the lands of the Bible. For about the last decade, we've been putting these kinds of journeys on tape, and you'll see now notebooks in hands of students in all of these countries as they begin to study how the places affect our understanding of the Bible. We hope in this series you'll be able to pick up some of that excitement as you see the archaeology and the history and the geography, and as it comes together for your understanding of what the Bible meant to the people that originally experienced God in the text. Today we want to look at the area of the northwest coastline of the Sea of Galilee. Between the hillside called today the Mount of Beatitudes, to remember Matthew 5, 6, and 7 and the Sermon on the Mount, and another towering mountain called Mount Arbel, between those two is a stretch of land where 70% of all of the Galilee sayings of Jesus took place. We're going to spend some time on both of those mountains looking at the vast vistas around it and try to get to the background of what we know about the disciples, characteristics of the disciples based on the geography, the archaeology, and the history around the sea. We hope you'll join us throughout the day as we spend some time together exploring the lands of the Bible. Mount of Beatitudes, can you tell that loud things down there will carry very well? If you sit here on a late afternoon, I've stayed in this guest house 5 or 6 times with different groups, and at night you can sit out here like when the sun goes down and all the tourists leave, and you can hear everything on the road down there. 2 guys can be yelling to each other and you can hear exactly what they're saying, which is great for the daytime and terrible for the middle of the night. The theme we wanted to look at today was 7 characteristics of the disciples. The first part of that theme is illustrated by where you're standing. There are 2 bookends on either end of the bookshelf you're standing on. One of them is at the Arbel Pass out there. Just before the generation of parents when Jesus is born, Joseph's generation, would remember that when Herod the Great was first made king of Judea, this is the Herod the Great of Jesus' birth story. When Herod the Great became king of Judea, he actually settled some old scores for Rome and came around and settled some of the uprisings in the Galilee. And one of the ones that he did was recorded by Josephus as he came, and he actually took soldiers who had cribs and grappling hooks and were standing up against the Issachari or the Zealots who were taking over the fortress areas and caves of Mount Arbel. And the description of the story is how they lowered cribs down like elevators and put the grappling hooks back and pulled men, women, and children to their death, throwing them to the bottom of the mountain because they were resisting the rise of the eagle that was Rome and Rome's vassal, the Herodian dynasty. What I'm trying to say is this: people that grew up here didn't have a nice view of the incoming of the Romans. And by the way, a little bit later, on the other end of this bookshelf, will be the city of Gamla that'll be destroyed in 67. That's the generation of the grandchildren of those who died on that mountain. Gamla was about 8,000 people until just before the battle. As the siege came on, people from all the villages around piled in, and about 15,000 people were here by the time the 3 Roman legions come and set up siege ramps around the outside of the city. In the first round of the battle, the Romans break into the lower part of the city and they start to move up from the bottom. 5,000 of the 15,000 defenders fought in the original battle and probably fell. During that time, the Romans were able to grab and capture as many as 5,000 others. So what you have is 5,000 left who are gathered toward the top of the site. Then just to the left of the circular tower, you can see a scattered number of stones. It was late in the night. The time was the 12th of October. The Romans piled in toward the upper city. The defenders realized there was no way they were going to be able to hold the city. As many as 5,000 people will hurl their children off the side and then jump to their death rather than be made slaves of Rome. If you didn't want to see your kids taken into slavery, the best thing you could do would be hurl them off and then jump. I'm not sanctioning what they did. I'm just trying to help you understand the world that they lived in. So whether you grew up just before the time of Jesus or just after the time of Jesus, this zone here was full of people that had a strong anti-Roman sentiment. They resented the Romans. They didn't like them. They were caught up in Jewish nationalism. As a result, by the way, what's the symbol of Jewish nationalism in the Gospels? It's like a flag, and it's on the coins of the revolt against Rome and on the coins that show Judea as captive. It's the palm tree. A palm branch is like a flag. So, when Jesus comes into Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives, in the triumphal entry, what do they throw in front of him? Palm branches. It's like they're saying, Hosanna, 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 get rid of these pig-eating pagans. And they threw down the palm branches in front of him. And that's why the men who were in charge of the temple said, tell the crowd to be quiet. What did Jesus say? If these be silent, what happens? The rocks and stones will cry out. Now, how do rocks and stones cry out in the Middle East? They throw them. In other words, if I tell them to be quiet, there's going to be a riot. Then it's going to get out of hand. Then the Romans are going to come. I can't tell them to be quiet. He's not saying rocks are going to start talking. It's a nice image, but all you have to do is watch the news here to figure out how rocks talk. It happens a lot, more than we wish. So the important thing for us is that the disciples that grew up in this region, down around the Sea of Galilee, grew up and were caught up in Jewish nationalism and anti-Jewish resistance movements. And a number of them, like Simon the Zealot, will come from parties that just absolutely hate the Romans. So the geography helps me because I know about what happened before the time of Jesus and just after the time of Jesus, and this corridor was caught up with people who were really upset about those things. The second thing I want you to know about them is that the disciples were immersed in John the Baptist's preaching. And if you read the beginning of John's Gospel, John the Baptist's preaching is apocalyptic. A winnowing fork in his hand, he will separate the wheat from the chaff. It's all about end times. They are caught up in end times prophetic movements. And the first 5 disciples come out of the John the Baptist evangelistic movement. And they're traded off to Jesus. And when they're traded off to Jesus, they're heavily, the end is near. There used to be a guy who was down on Ben Yehuda Street who walked around with a long white beard and a kind of white long hair in a toga with a sign that said on the front, the end is near. And on the back it said, so come have a beer at the Prophet's Pub. It was a great kind of, way of showing the, but it was that's the idea, that's the feeling. When you open up the Gospels, what I want you to hear in the background is dun dun, dun dun, dun 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 dun. It's coming. And the end is near. And that's why in John 6, when Jesus feeds the thousands along the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, they want to make him king because it's the time of the Passover and they think it's about to happen. They believe it. Third, if you grew up along here, you would be suspicious of Gentiles and you would not want to mix with them. You're not comfortable with that side of the lake. Those people have pigs running around. They eat ham. Those people over there don't know the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and the traditions that are so much a part of our life. So over here, the villages here, we're happy. Over there, not so much. Here we're comfortable and we can eat. Let me give you one evidence for that. Did you know that on the north shore of the Sea of Galilee, when Jesus fed thousands of people, the disciples turned to him and say, "There's no place for us to buy bread. They are 15 minutes walk from a major city, but it's a Gentile city. There's no place for us to buy bread. We can't buy it. Better to starve than to eat their bread." You have to understand how divided they were. And as a result, people that grew up in this region were very, very suspicious of Gentiles, so they didn't mix with them. That's why the second half of the book of Acts is absolutely horrendous for the Jews in Jerusalem who know Jesus is Messiah, and all of a sudden they got all these guys coming in who are over there in Asia Minor who are coming to Jesus, and what are we going to do? Those people aren't even Jewish. The culture was so hard for them. It's funny to me to be in a time when people are surprised that we might even try to elect a woman or an African background president. I think that's really funny to me because I grew up in a society that says you shouldn't care about those things. But boy, if I was a little older, the generation before me, they're gasping at the idea. So it's funny how your culture plays into it. A couple of things I wanted you to know about the background. There are altogether 7 characteristics. You should know by now 3 of them. We've been talking about the characteristics of the disciples. And I mentioned to you earlier that they were influenced by the zealot movement. And this mountain surely shows, this Mount Arbel, surely shows why. 38 BC, when the battle between the Antigonus faction and the Herodian faction was establishing Rome and who they were going to back here, hundreds of people die. When Rome comes, they bring a gold standard with an eagle at the top that is not sympathetic with the traditions of the fathers, and they'll kill who they have to get the power that they want. We also talked about the apocalyptic sense, the end times sense that people had. A third thing we mentioned was that people were suspicious of Gentiles. RJs, religious Jews, were suspicious of Gentiles and did not mix with them. I'd like to continue that theme to tell you a couple of more things that we know about the disciples based on what we see around the sea. One of the things we saw when we stood in the area of the boat, what we call the Jesus boat, was that the disciples are in fact wealthier than we imagine them to be. Why do I say that? Well, do you remember that the disciples left their nets and their hired servants to follow him? These are not country bumpkins that fish because they have nothing better to do. The Zebedee and Sons Fishing Company Incorporated is a happening thing. They're making money. What does that mean? Well, the implication is it's a real sacrifice for them to leave. It's not just a light thing for them to leave. Remember, it's Mrs. Zebedee who says to Jesus, "When you come into your kingdom, would you put my children on your right and on your left?" She is status conscious. These are people that have money. Because I think sometimes we tell the story of the disciples like they're country bumpkins that never really had an education, and nobody, they don't really know stuff, and they really kind of didn't have anything else to do. And Jesus walked along and they said, "Come, follow me." And they all stood up and walked in a single file line because they weren't doing anything anyway. No, when they left their nets, they left their work. Another thing that we need to understand is that when we talk about collectivism, they were totally immersed in a collective mentality. Think about the insula-style house. Think about living all together. Some of you are in dorms and you're saying, "I don't have to think about it, I do it every day." Dorms have their downside. I mean, the fact of the matter is, in the couple of years since we started the dormitories at Great Commission Bible Institute, it's been funny because, it's in the beginning of the year, you have the guys and then you have the girls and you worry about their interactions and they all kind of impress each other. And then they live with each other for a few weeks and they're not really interested in each other at all anymore because they know each other pretty well. Then it becomes, how do you stop them from killing each other? Various other things. And eventually they become like brothers and sisters. And that's been our experience each time. In a collective situation, you have no private time and no private space. I want you to understand, some of you are going, I know, my roommate, but I want you to understand, Jesus did not simply preach a sermon and go home to his 3-bedroom, 2-bath rancher, and they all went home to their houses and then had roast preacher for lunch. It didn't work like that. He lived with them. Now, I love my students, and I still love going home to my wife every night and not living with them. And I can only tell you this. Everybody understands that Jesus had an impact on his disciples, but they forget that the impact of the disciples was also on him. When I did my first film on the life of Jesus, nearly 25 years ago, 20-some years ago, I wanted to have the disciples have a water fight on the Sea of Galilee. I thought it'd be a really cool scene. We took it out because we thought people would think it's irreverent. But why? Why did the guys all of a sudden meet him and then they couldn't fool around anymore? Is that like any disciple you know? I am absolutely certain that somebody was squirting Peter in the back of the head with water. You know, because he's annoying. How do I know he's annoying? Because he's always got his hand up. Oh, I know, and he's usually wrong. I mean, come on, every time you have a student like that, it's like, ugh, somebody shut them up, will you? Now, the disciples were also impacted by the radical classification of people. We're going to go now to a baptismal place. And when we get there, you're going to find that the ritual standards of immersion baths, there was a radical intensity about cleansing. You know, when people went into the Second Temple, you didn't just kind of go in there and in the middle stop by the men's room. You know, if your body excretes anything besides sweat and tears, you were required to go back through the mikvah process and get another baptism to come in with a ticket that says cleansed. Okay? As a result, there was this intensity about cleansing. And we're going to talk about it when we get to the baptism site. But I want you to know that people that share and celebrate cleansing in their life often see themselves as somewhat better than other people. Let me say it this way. Sometimes people grow up in an environment where God has really done some good things for them. And they're so excited about what God is doing with them, they kind of look at the other people around them with this provincial mentality of, here we are in the tower where God is at work and all you little people are out there. Isn't it sad that you don't know what's really happening? Isn't it sad that you don't have all these great things happening? The problem with the disciples was a grammar one. They kept confusing nouns and adjectives. See, Jesus saw a woman that sinned. They saw an adulteress. They tagged the sin on the person and couldn't see the person for the sin. And I want you to think about that. It's terribly important that you separate in your mind the humanity of the person and dignity and image stamp of God in the person and their bad choices. Because today, I go into churches and I hear sermons and sometimes I hear hatred in our voice for people who practice some things that I know are abominations. But they're not an abomination, their choice is. They're a person. And we've got to separate between people and the acts that they're doing, because if we don't do that, we will not be able to speak redemption into their life. When you write somebody off because they're not worth it anymore, you create a situation where you might as well have cast them into hell yourself. So the disciples, remember the disciples went through Samaria on John 4 on the way north? And Jesus meets the woman at the well, and they're shocked that he's like talking to her. Later on, he doesn't call, he doesn't write, he doesn't come back to Samaria for a long time, and it's the end of his ministry, and he's on his way up to Jerusalem. He spends some time in a little village called Ephraim, and he makes his way in and sees some Samaritans, and they haven't heard from him in a long time, and they're not too impressed because his ministry really didn't do follow-up the way it should have. And so they don't accept him with open arms a second time. And the disciples look at Jesus and say, why don't you call down fire from heaven and make them toast? And I find it interesting that when people here in the plain saw Jesus day in and day out and they didn't accept him, no disciple said, call down fire from heaven. But in Samaria, when they didn't accept him, the second time he was there, why don't you call down fire and make them toast? You know why? Because they didn't really like Samaritans anyway. See, the bottom line is what's underneath some of our prejudice is just plain hatred. It's not about their choices. It's we don't really like them anyway. And so underneath of that, we kind of pretty it up with God talk and say, can you believe what they're doing? When I look with mercy, I see another person who made choices that maybe I didn't make, but I could have made. There, but by the grace of God, go I. So be careful about the radical classification of people. The disciples kept falling in it. You know why? Because they grew up in an us and them world. We are the people that have God, and the other people don't. And when you create an us and them world, you lose God's heart. See, God sees two kinds of people: the people who know him and the people who need to. And that's the way to view it. He has a mission heart. One last characteristic of the disciples. And I love this one. And I love to have it over the Sea of Galilee over my shoulder, because the disciples don't get it all the first time. You can say amen if you want. The disciples didn't get it the first time. They had to be called more than once. I count 3 calls of Peter in the New Testament. Did you know that? He's called once, and he's part-time disciple, part-time fisherman. But there's an interesting little spot in the Gospels, and if you read carefully, here's what you find. You find that he's missed the meeting, and he's been fishing when Jesus has been teaching. And so Jesus comes in, and he comes up to Peter, and Peter's just coming out, and Simon is now cleaning his nets, and he's been fishing, and he gets called a second time cleaning his net. The third time he gets called is at the end of the ministry. And what happens? There they are on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. Remember what happened? Jesus was crucified, then he was raised, then he saw them in the place of the upper room. First they were missing some of them. Then Thomas, doubting Thomas, right? Second time they're all there. And then he says, listen, Peter gets the boys together and says, you know, I'm going fishing. And they make their way back up to Galilee. And John 21 says this: the boys had been out fishing that night, and that night they had a failure again, an all-night failure. It occurs over and over in Peter's life. Remember? The night he says, I don't even know him. Then the next time you see him, an all-night fishing, and he doesn't do it. It doesn't work. Now, focus for a second. There they are. Jesus has been raised, and he is on the shore, and he's cooking some fish. And the boys are in the boat, and one of the boys, John, leans over and says, Pete, see that guy on the shore? I think it's the Lord. No, yeah, I think it's the Lord. What does Peter do? You got to love Peter. He's impetuous. He throws himself out of the boat, right? He puts on a cloak because his legs are showing. Remember, nakedness is anything above the ankle bone showing. He's not naked in the boat with the boys. It's just his legs are showing. So he throws his cloak on. He dumps himself in the water, slogs himself up onto the beach. And then it says the other boys came up behind him, dragging up just a little bit because they were not far from land. I love that because it says he couldn't just wait a little bit like everybody else. He's got to get out of the boat. So you see Jesus, Peter, fish, fire, drip, 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 drip. And the other boys come up. It's interesting. They knew it was Jesus because he yelled out to them, have you caught anything? No. Cast onto the other side and you will find. And they pull up 153 fish. Peter comes. By the time he gets there, Jesus already has fish. You have to understand that in the Middle East, there's a concept of covenant that is at a meal. People do not eat a meal with people here unless they have a relationship with them. It's called a meal covenant. Remember Jacob and Laban had problems with each other? And when they sat down and ate together, they made a covenant together. They had a meal together. Sadat and Begin, when they made the peace that it was the Sinai and the peace with Egypt, they ate together in Beersheba. The big question when Netanyahu and Arafat got together some years ago was, did they eat together? Thou preparest the table before me in the presence of my enemies means You make me able to sit down and reconcile with my enemies and have a meal. Okay? So what was Jesus doing by offering fish to Peter? Okay, Pete, you blew it. You said you didn't know me. You said it 3 times. The rooster crowed just like I told you. I showed up in the upper room and you didn't say anything, Pete. I showed up a second time and you didn't say anything, Pete. You always say something, but now you're not talking. You're doing wallflower, Peter. There's something really wrong. Sit down and eat breakfast. Everything's fine. And I want to eat it in front of the other disciples with you. Share some fish, because I want them to know I'm okay with you. And right there was the last call of Peter. And Peter, who denied Jesus, just a few chapters into the book of Acts, by chapter 3, will be standing up and saying, "You killed the Prince of Life. Do you know what you've done?" Where did he get this boldness? He got it from the acceptance he got from Jesus and the power he got from the coming of the Spirit of God in Acts chapter 2. And it revolutionized his life. And you have it too. You have the acceptance of Jesus. Listen to me for a minute. I'm almost done and we got to go. The number one thing a 20-year-old person who knows Jesus needs to do is find your identity in Him. Not in your culture, not in your nationality, not in your sexuality. Find it in Him. If you don't, you'll never hear His voice clearly and you won't go where He wants you to go. You are who He says you are and no one else. And once you find that identity, then the next thing you grab onto is the power or empowering of His Spirit to accomplish His goals in your life. The disciples had to be called more than once. There are 7 characteristics of the disciples that we can learn about that are going to help you to be better disciples. I want to take a few minutes here and just talk about what did Jesus say. Now, if you have a red letter edition of the New Testament, the red letters tell you what Jesus' words were. All of it is the Word of God, but the red letters tell you what came out of His mouth. There is not in the New Testament a life of Jesus. What we have are what were called in the early church the 4 evangelists. That's a good way to think of the Gospels. Think of them as 4 evangelical tracts or evangelistic outreach booklets to tell you who Jesus was. Students, Matthew gives us what? The words of Jesus. There's more red in a red letter edition of Matthew than in any other Gospel. So if you want to know where Jesus said something, go to Matthew. Now, Matthew's Gospel, if it's about the words and we're doing the teachings of Jesus, let's stay with Matthew for a minute. Matthew has 5 major sermons. The first one is Matthew 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount. And it's Jesus went somewhere along here and He began to teach. Matthew 5, 6, and 7. That sermon is actually broken into 3 parts. It'll be the character of a disciple is chapter 5. The commitment of a disciple is chapter 6. And the choices of a disciple is chapter 7. It's a setting for Jesus to tell the early followers, listen, this is what I'm looking for. You cannot be my disciple if you do not want to be this. It's an interesting place. I want you to picture a large number of people. It's early in the morning. The disciples have been up all night fishing. They clean out their nets, and before they go to bed, they come to the sermon. So they would come together, and before it was too hot in the daytime, they would be sitting here. The crowds would come, and Jesus would begin teaching. Now, in Matthew 5, 6, and 7, I told you that this is really a 3-part sermon. And the beginning is the character of a disciple. So, to set the stage for the teachings of Jesus, I want you to listen to something for a minute. Jesus began with 8 character traits for a disciple. And He opens in Matthew 5, and it says, Jesus saw the crowds. He went up onto a hillside or a mountain, and after He sat down, His disciples came to Him, and you know why. He opened His mouth, and began to teach them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the gentle, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. Blessed are those who have been persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you and persecute you and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Now, I want you to listen to what he said. He said, I want to tell you what the character of somebody who follows me is like. He's a person who's bankrupt in spirit. In other words, you can't walk around being self-sufficient and be my disciple. You have to recognize bankruptcy in your spirit. And then he says, you also can't be self-secure. You have to be able to mourn so that I can comfort you. You have to be not self-reliant, but gentle. You can't be self-satisfied, but hunger and thirst for righteousness. You can't be self-focused, but merciful. You can't be divided in your heart, but pure in heart. You can't have your own agenda. You need to be a peacemaker. You can't be self-defensive. You need to be ready to be persecuted. In other words, you want to be my disciple, this is what it's going to take. It's interesting, Jesus doesn't start his first sermon in Matthew with, let me tell you all the benefits of belonging to me. He starts off with, let me tell you the requirements. And I just want to posit the idea that I'm wondering if one of the problems we're having with faithfulness in the work of God is that many people came in for selfish reasons without any sense that there was anything required of them. If we preach a gospel that doesn't make clear that the end story is the glory of the Son of God, the end story is not your glory. If we don't do that, I'm wondering if we're not going to be leading people in the wrong direction. And then Jesus says this in Matthew 5:17, do not think that I came to abolish the law of the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. Now, the word abolish is actually a translation of an agricultural term, to uproot. Don't think I came to take the roots of the law and pull them out. I didn't. By the way, can I just tell you, that is exactly what seminary taught me he did. That used to be the law, now it's not, and that was all stuff that all got done away with. You need to understand that when God made an agreement with the Jewish people, he made it with the people who were at Sinai. He didn't make it with the earth, he made it with the people that were there. And he told them to keep certain standards. Jesus didn't come bringing the salvation to the lost sheep of the house of Israel to uproot Moses' law. Because it wasn't Moses' law, it was God's law. What he did do was, when I say he fulfilled it, a lot of Christians think that that means he kept it all and thereby he closed the book. The word fulfill, actually, it's reminiscent of the idea of setting a bone that is broken and is out of place. I came to put the bone back where it belongs so it can heal properly. The problem is, you heard what I said, but you missed the point. I guess the best illustration I can give you is if I wrote a book on relationships and how to have a passionate, wonderful relationship with your wife, and then I had Jim Dobson write the foreword so people actually bought the book. And Rod buys the book and he goes, I want to have a passionate relationship with Marge. And so he buys the book and he reads the book. And it says in chapter 3, if you're going to have a passionate relationship with your wife, you have to give her 3 incredibly good kisses a day. And so he comes in, he gets the book, he comes in the door, there's Marge standing there at the stove. He runs over, he grabs her, he tosses her over, and he kisses her all the way to her toes. I mean, he kisses her, the kiss that, oh, it's wonderful. And while he's doing it, he's checking it off in the book behind her head. The problem is, he got the list, but he missed the point. And the rest of the beginning of this sermon, he says, listen, the character of a disciple has to understand, I make the rules. I know what I want. And so he starts to tell him, you've heard it said, but I say unto you. Now what he's not saying is, it used to be wrong and now it's not. I changed my mind. What he's saying is, you heard these words, but you missed what I was saying. You heard it said, you shall not kill, but I'm telling you, you need to be a relationship builder. If you cut your brother down, if you harm him, and you realize that that's what you've done, and you get to the altar of the temple, leave your gift and go make it right with your brother. I didn't tell you don't kill, just meaning don't kill. I mean you be a relationship builder. You only heard the negative side of the command, you never heard the positive side. And in every one of these, you have heard it said, but I say unto you sayings, what he's doing is trying to say, you got the list, but missed the point. I'm going to pick up this idea in a little bit, but I want you to understand he's talking about the character of a disciple. He moves from that character of a disciple onward, and in chapter 6, he's going to go on and talk about the commitment that a disciple has to have. You need to be committed to pray. You need to be committed to trust me for what you have. And finally, he closes off the sermon in chapter 7 with choices. There is a wide gate, there's a broad way, and there's a small gate and a small way. And broad is the gate that leads to destruction, and many there be that will go in that way. But this is the way I want you to go. There are two kinds of trees. He keeps making choices between this and that, this and that. And what he says is, the choice to follow me is not the easy one, and it's not the obvious one. You must choose. Out here on a hillside, you can see these lovely flowers, and you can get all caught up in the, there's a nice breeze, and you can see just the lovely plants, and look down to the Sea of Galilee and watch the fishermen. He was saying some very hard things. So let me leave you with this. The choice to follow Jesus is a real choice. It's a choice about who's going to run your life. The gospel is not Jesus came, died, and he wants to save you, and now you can go live as you choose. That's not the gospel he taught. Coming right out of the gate, he said, in order to be my disciple, you must understand there is a character set of traits I'm looking for. The rules have been written in the Word. There are commitments you must make. This is a choice. Make the choice. And I get concerned in the day in which we live, because I'm hearing people say they're teaching the gospel when it sounds like what they're doing is giving people a free pass on sin with fire insurance at the end. That doesn't sound like Jesus at all when you listen to what he said. Matthew 5, 6, and 7. I just did a really quick look at it because I want to come back and do some other things about his teaching. Jesus said the problem with the law is this. It's my law and it's good. There's nothing wrong with it. The problem is you got the law but missed the point. And so he said from the very beginning, you think just because you don't do the wrong thing that you're doing the right thing. That's not true. And he says, I want to tell you what I meant by this. You heard it said, do not commit adultery. But I say to you, everyone that looks at a woman with lust for her has committed adultery already in his heart. If your right eye makes you stumble, tear it out, throw it from you. It's better to lose one of your parts of your body than your whole body to be thrown into hell. If your right hand offends you, cut it off, throw it from you. It's better that you lose this part than your whole body. What does he say? Maim yourself? Look, guys, listen to me. Ladies, you don't have to listen to this. Does any guy here believe that if the standard was what you thought in your heart, that any of us would still have eyes after junior high? So is he telling you to rip your eyes? No, think about the audience. Sitting around here are people who are Jewish. The heart of a Jew was rooted in the temple. So he said to them, it's more important that you build relationships than leave an offering at the temple. Now he says, cut off your hand, cut out your eye. If you did that, what is the one place you could never go for the rest of your life as a Jew? The temple. He says, you keep making the temple everything. And I'm telling you, people first. And I'm telling you, it's what's going on in your heart, not just your presence at the temple. When I lived in Fort Myers, one of the churches in Fort Myers that had Mass each Sunday had a small parking lot, and they were expanding the church, and they didn't have enough room for the people. So they actually had a guy standing out there so that you could drive in the front and have somebody check this little stamp, this little thing to say that you showed up for Mass, and then you could drive back out. so that they couldn't actually get you in, but you fulfilled your obligation for Mass. And here's my problem. My problem is it's a total misunderstanding. I want your heart, not just your body. Do you know how many people are standing in church lusting after someone else? Do people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me? It's not what I'm looking for. He says, you've heard it said, the ancients were told, you shall not make false vows, but shall fulfill your vows to the Lord. But I say to you, make no oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, it is the footstool of his feet, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor shall you make an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black, but let your statement be yes, yes, no, no. Anything beyond these is of evil. He says, listen, you keep finding ways to not say what you're trying to say. We hire lawyers for this today. Did you ever look at a contract? Basically, my brother who works in a law office says it this way. They spend 15 minutes telling you how they'll help you and 3 hours telling you how they won't. Trying to kind of say, well, but this doesn't mean this and that doesn't mean that and you really can't do this. What we're doing is building a language that's more and more duplicitous. I sat in a meeting of Christian leaders a couple weeks ago, and somebody sat there with a group of pastors trying to describe to me that it was unethical but not immoral. What they did was unethical, but it wasn't immoral. I didn't know what the difference was. To me, if you're not trying to just do what you say and say what you do, you're not being honest. It's that simple. Guys, listen, one of the ploys that we're living in today is people making wrong right by making it so complicated you can't tell. And I got to tell you, I live in the day when I can get a 100-page cell phone bill, and I still don't know what I'm paying for. We are over-informed and undereducated. And what happens is people are doing it in the Christian world as well, taking simple things and trying to make it look like it's really okay. But the heart of God gets lost. So all of these, I'll just do one more and then we'll quit. He says, you've heard it said, an eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth. Deuteronomy 19, Leviticus 24, the standard of the scales or balances. But I say to you, do not resist an evil person. Whoever slaps you on the right cheek, what do? Turn the other cheek also. If anybody wants you to sue you and take your shirt, let him have your cloak or your coat. If he forces you to go a mile, go 2 miles. Give to him who asks of you, and to him that would borrow from you, do not turn away. You know what he's not saying, look, if you're a believer, just get trampled on. Just let everybody take your stuff. It's not what he's saying at all. He's not saying when you run a government, just let people do whatever they want. What he's saying is, you've heard it said that there's a law of the balances, eye for eye and tooth for tooth. But if you go back and look at that law in Leviticus 19 and Deuteronomy 24, do you know what that was all about? It was, let the punishment fit the crime. If a man steals an orange, don't cut off his head. It's too much. Make sure the punishment fits the crime. So here's what I want you to do. When someone wrongs you, you be so slow to react. Respond, don't react. What's the difference? About 10 seconds. You be so slow to respond and not react that they can hit you again. And it might mean you get hit twice, but you don't jump too quickly. Think about what you're saying before you talk. Because I personally know people in ministry who 50 years ago had someone hurt their heart by what they told them as a child. And they have gone through their life defeated because of the words of somebody 50 years ago who said something harsh in a moment of anger. If I could plead with the young people here for one thing, it's this. You are living in a time when in the absence of relationship in our communities, all we have left is the law. And so now, it's not funny anymore. You used to throw a ball and it went through a neighbor's window, and your mom would go to their mom and you'd end up doing chores or whatever, and they'd take care of the window. Now you're getting a misdemeanor charge. And the police are coming. And people don't talk to each other. And it's all legal. It's all tough. Listen, you're living in a time when there aren't as many do-overs. So be careful where you step. Take your time with your mouth. Take your time with your responses. People will hurt you. The measure of your walk with God is not the cards you're dealt, but how you play them. The measure of your walk is whether or not you're careful to respond well. We say mature people are responsible, able to respond. Okay? Immature, reactable. Mature, responsible. Look, the point that I'm making is simply this. Jesus' sermon wasn't to come and say, you know that whole section that was legal code? Throw it out. I'm going to start a whole new religion. Got this Christian thing going. They're going to put up churches and we can get rid of all that old stuff. What he was saying is, guys, you got the list, but you missed a walk with God. You heard what I said, but you missed the point. The point is my heart is people. The point is my heart is relationship. The point is that I would rather have relationship than religion. So it's more important to me that you get the things straightened out with people than keep bringing me all these gifts and building me all these buildings and turning it into all these budgets and bringing in all the bodies and bringing in the conventions and the publishing houses and showing how much stuff you did. I'm interested in how many people you have relationship with in ministry, not how big you built your thing. Sad will be the day of the Bema seat when many people stand thinking, I built a great thing, and it will be the janitor who built relationships, and he will be the one that is the champion of the whole ministry. Okay? I just want you to walk away with a sense that you know something about the characteristics of the disciples, and you know something about the point of the story, which for Jesus was, listen guys, you heard what I said, but you missed the point of what I said. If you got that, you understood. You know, every time I stand here, I think about when God put on human skin, he chose here. And I like it because it gives me a good perspective that all around there's a beauty about the place and a simplicity. When we get to Jerusalem, everything's built up. Galilee still looks a lot like it looked because farmers preserve the land more than anything else. Okay? Well, it's been a beautiful journey from the top of Mount Arbel and those vast vistas of the Sea of Galilee, and even the rolling hills on the north shore with the Mount of Beatitudes. We've been able to look and explore just a little bit about what we know about the disciples, some of their background, how they felt about things. We hope you join us next time as we continue exploring the lands of the Bible.